run our data science teams. I have a lot of say in our data strategy. I've been kind of building and running data teams for a while. Had a chance to work on some really interesting data sets at a lot of interesting companies. Started out my journey at a company called StubHub, which is a ticket marketplace. You've probably heard of it now. Back in the day, we were a teeny tiny startup. Really built and ran analytics from the ground up. From there, I moved to a company called Zynga. Does anybody remember Farmville? There were like cute cows and sheep and stuff. It was a lot of fun. Got to work with some really interesting gaming data sets. From there, I moved to a company called Okta, which is a SaaS identity management software company, really different industry. Really got to work with some interesting data around the cloud, around different B2B products. And from there, I moved to a company called Strava, which is where I'm at now. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Strava in a minute. But something that's been pretty constant across my career is thinking about using data to build great products. And something that has happened to me over and over again as I've joined different organizations is I get one of two reactions. I either get the, yay, data is here, all of our problems are solved, or I get the, well, we haven't built anything yet. What could you possibly say? We don't have any data. So I think the reality is a lot more subtle, a lot more complicated than that. So I'm going to talk you through some stories about how we use data in our product building and some potentially unexpected ways that data and the teams that you build around data can play out in your organization. So something I think a lot about is, how can data really be this beacon across a sea of possible product decisions? We often have a lot of ideas. How do we know what we should build? Which of our ideas should we pick? How do we know if what we built is any good? Oops. Sorry, go backwards. Can I go? Am I trying to go forwards? Okay, well, can I go back? We'll stop here. Is the clicker working? Or are you trying to follow me? Okay, we'll go back. Nope. All right, cool. So our reality is that product development's really expensive. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of engineering resources. If you get it wrong and you have to rebuild, really pretty inexpensive proposition. So what I like to think about is how data can be this really valuable resource, even if you haven't been somewhere before. How can you really try to bring data into your development process and really think about who you hire onto your data teams to help you do that? So let me step back for a minute and tell you a little bit more about Strava to give you some grounding in the stories I'm going to tell in a few minutes. Our mission is to connect athletes to what motivates them and help them find their personal best. So we are a platform for athletes. We're the world's largest active network. We have about 45 million athletes on Strava. We're in virtually every country in the world. Interestingly, for a company that's based in San Francisco, California, over 80% of our athletes are outside of the US. So we really have to think globally when we're building. We've had over 2 billion activities uploaded, and we get about 20 million new activities every week. So we're working at a scale that's pretty exciting. We have really rich data sets of activities that are happening across the world. All right, so I'm going to talk about kind of a first example of how we really use data in our product development. I call this the North Star. So you probably know what a North Star is. It's the star that guides sailors in the nighttime. Interestingly, it stays fixed while the rest of the night sky turns. I love this photograph, really capturing that. The North Star there in the middle, the rest of the stars kind of circling around it. And so North Stars really help us mark the way and help us find our way. So this is an example of how we use, we call North Star metrics. So in a product development process, we may not know what we're building, but we can know what we want to get to or what we want to achieve. So this was an example where we had some research showing that our performance, like our app performance, had really degraded over time. We've been around for about 10 years. We've been building all sorts of new features, not really paying attention to this, and the just app performance had degraded, especially for all the athletes who live in parts of the world where there's slower connection speeds or maybe using older devices. And we showed that this had a really negative impact on their retention. So we decided to put a product team against this and said, we think if you can improve our performance, and we came up with a metric we call time to something useful, which is really that you push the app icon and how long does it take to get you into the feed or something useful. And if we think we can get a big chunk of our athletes over this threshold, that's going to have a really positive impact on our retention and our long-term business health. So we came up with this metric. We set some aggressive goals. In this chart from a couple months ago, our Android team had kind of blown through the goal. iOS did eventually catch up. So one of the interesting things about this is that it really got the company to rally around this cause. We had this one product team working on it, but there were also a lot of infrastructure engineers, a lot of platform engineers, a lot of other folks in the business coming together. We celebrated this on a weekly basis at our company all hands. We had a segment we'd call down and to the right. So usually in business, you want up and to the right, like profits and sales and growth. This was kind of loading time. We wanted it to go down and to the right. This was some engineers got together and just removed something entirely from our code base. They'd known it was causing slowness. They knew it wasn't necessary. They never had a reason to go in before. So they went in and removed it, and then they had a little bit of fun, put this in our all hands, down into the abyss, and deprecating old emojis. All right, so another way that our data teams, our analysts, contribute to product development is in experimentation, which you've probably heard of, hopefully you've heard of. It's a really important practice. So one of the things we think a lot about is how we can remove bias from what we build the things our users actually want. You're probably familiar with sorts of bias that are around gender bias or racial bias. There's all sorts of other kinds of bias that can creep in, particularly the bias to build what I think is needed or what I want as a developer. But we know that our community is global. We only have about 200 employees. We really have to think beyond just who's in the room building it. So a really great way we do that is by pulling in different sorts of data. So, my team gets all of our kind of quantitative data. We spend a lot of time looking at our behavioral signals. This is a story that is about how social is an important part of our platform. And so we've discovered that, despite all of the kind of fancy tools and tracking technology, at the end of the day, what keeps people active is really other people. And so we have a number of different behavioral signals around how people look at each other's activities, how they give them kudos, how they comment on them. We've also done some user research to get some qualitative input around this and how we can continue building. Something we've discovered is that it's not just only people congratulating you or kind of commenting on your activity, but this idea of kind of sweating and getting dirty together is also a really big motivator. We have some of our own experience, so even though we know we're not completely representative, we can sort of look at how we use the product ourselves. This is an example, or this is a few folks from my team who went and did a popular run in the Bay Area. We have a part of the product that will group activities together. So if you go out and run with some friends or go for a ride or walk together, it automatically figures out that you were together and kind of groups them together so you can kind of comment and share that experience. And then we have community input. So an often overlooked part of the data set that you can really bring in to make some interesting impact is, what does your community say? What are the people who use your product, who love your product, who want you to improve your product say? So we found this. It became really popular. It had about 200 comments and 300 upvotes, which is pretty big for us. It was the idea of tagging a friend and adding them to an activity. So pretty common use case is you actually go out for a walk or a ride or a run with a group of people, and someone forgets to turn on their tracking, somebody forgets their watch. Only one person has a kind of record of that, but there were actually 2 or 3 or 4 other people there. So the community really wanted this ability to kind of bring their friends in so that they could have that cool grouped activity experience. So we took all of these insights, kind of our quantitative, our qualitative, our community input, and really put that together and said, let's build something. It still doesn't tell you exactly what to build or how to build it or how to surface it in the product, and that's where experimentation really comes in. So our product teams got together, did some brainstorming, came up with some prototypes, and then started testing things. Putting things in the product, figuring out what kinds of messaging worked, what kind of surfaces worked. So this is an example when you record an activity, and if your friend wasn't recording as well and didn't get grouped with you, you can simply tag them in. And so this was the kind of winning variant. We found it had about 5 times as many invites as our kind of standard just non-contextual invite flow, which was pretty good. And we added some tracking so we can actually see how many of those are going out to new people who aren't already on Strava, and are those people converting back to become members. All right, so the third one is around telling data stories. So this has become an area that I've been increasingly kind of interested in and fascinated by as I've gone through my career, is looking at what kinds of stories can we tell both to ourselves, to our companies, about who's using our products and how they're using our products, but also what can we say about the broader world using the data that we have. And how does this impact who we want to bring onto the team, and who's really going to be thinking about how we can turn our data into stories. So some of the ingredients that I think about when we're thinking about telling Strava story, and I've done this at some previous companies as well, is really think about unique data sets. What data do we have that's really unique to us, that's kind of different from other companies? Second, trends people care about. If you have trends but they're not that interesting, or they're not things that are kind of useful for people, not going to be as interesting. So really what's going on in the world, what are the headlines, what are the trends, what can you say about them? And then adding in that, telling it in a compelling way, adding context, adding the kind of visualizations, and the stories that really help resonate. So the next few slides are from a report we did last year. We kind of do on an annual basis we call Year in Sport, where we look back and across all of the activities and the things that happen on our platform and try to say, what are some of the trends that we're seeing in sport? What are some of the interesting points we can make? So last year we looked at women in sport and tried to understand some of the gender trends and how women might be different from men. We know historically women are rather underrepresented in sport, similar to kind of other aspects of life. And so we found some interesting things like men are more likely to be cyclists on Strava, women are much more likely to be runners. We looked into kind of favorite race distances. Half marathons are really popular among women, although there's also quite a lot of women doing marathons and 10Ks and other distances. The next one around being social. So I mentioned this. We found this really key insight that being social helps keep people active. So we found some interesting stats around this, that being social actually leads to people spending more time being active by about 10% and going further distances by about 21%. So pretty interesting, and kind of proof that this motivation of having other people with you is really real. And then commuting is a topic that's kind of near and dear to our hearts. We have a product line that's all about working with kind of cities and departments of transportation to use Strava data to help improve infrastructure. And so we looked into, how are people commuting? What can we say about it? How far are they going? How much is that increasing year over year? And even things like the amount of carbon offset from people using bikes or running instead of using a car. So it's kind of over 1 billion pounds of carbon offset last year, which is pretty substantial. So a lot of this we use to turn into opportunities for press coverage. So press is really interested in data these days, which is kind of a fortunate trend for us. But anything that we can say that kind of adds those proof points, adds the numbers into the human stories, really seems to resonate. So we had a couple stories around actually cycling or running commuting, interestingly, being a lot faster than driving to work, particularly in a number of British cities. I can say this is somewhat true in San Francisco as well, at least on the cycling side. We had some coverage around sort of middle-aged people are actually being fit. It's not only the youngest people, that there are people kind of, continue to be active like throughout their lives. And then also a number of stories around the idea of breaking New Year's resolutions. We know lots of people make resolutions. It's really hard to stick with them. We've used data to try to pinpoint exactly when in the year people actually drop off of their resolutions. So this has been a really successful way for us to get more awareness of Strava and also kind of showcase our data and what it can do, and really have people thinking about, as we go through our day-to-day, how can we really highlight the things that are interesting. Another example, something that happened last year, we were able to use our data to look at a couple of wildfires that happened in the Bay Area in Northern California. So there were wildfires in 2017 and 2018 that were very devastating, loss of life, loss of property. So what we wanted to do is look and see how is this actually also impacting people's activity levels. And so on the right-hand side, you can see in the 2018 fires, the impact was both faster and more severe. The air quality really degraded and lasted in a poor state for much longer. So really reflecting that we're able to see in our data sets things that are happening in the broader world. And then maybe on a more hopeful note, we worked with some researchers to use Strava community data to help them study how firefighters battling wildfires can actually be more effective. So they looked at how long it takes to traverse various grades of terrain. It takes longer to go uphill than it does on a flat. A lot of our wildfires are in hills or in mountains, so this is really important in calculating how long it's going to take to get somewhere, what are the best routes. And so this was the largest data set that they'd ever been able to assemble in order to study this. So hopefully this will help plan better routes of attack for wildfires in the future. All right, so just to wrap up, so thinking about data teams and some examples of how data kind of flows into our product development and also how we think about talking about our company and our world. What I think about, and when I look at hiring people and bringing people into my data teams, there's people who can really think about identifying North Stars, who can really think about crafting metrics that make sense, that get teams to rally, that get cross-functional partners to rally, that really focus everybody and really help us make faster decisions are really critical. Second, experimentation, to really kind of turn your ideas into good experiences, kind of take that bias out of, I think this is going to be wonderful. I have some research suggesting it will be. Well, let's prove it. Let's do an experiment. Let's check and make sure this is actually an incremental improvement over what we had before. And then finally, thinking about turning data into stories that resonate both internally and externally, really powerful, both for, again, rallying people in your company around, what does your universe of people look like, and then also what does the external world look like. And I think something I would say about this is that, it seems potentially a bit easier in a consumer context when you have kind of people out in the world. Also, I've done this in a B2B context. So really thinking about, across your portfolio and the products that you build, where might these things fit in? What do you have to say that's interesting about your industry? It may not necessarily be, about wildfires or runners, but there's quite a lot going on, a lot of companies. The interesting data you collect might be relevant to your own customers, might be relevant across the particular industry you work in. So really try to, think creatively, think expansively, bring people into your data teams that are not only strong technically, but also can think about the broader picture as well. So with that, thank you, and I think we'll have time for some Q&A. Do we have a microphone going around, or should we?
Thank you for your talk. I have two questions. First, how Strava classify people for athletes versus amateurs, runners, so on. And the second, how does Strava know about the New Year's resolution? Do they analyze text data and so on?
Yeah, so first question, how do we think about kind of athletes versus everybody else? We take a pretty expansive view. I think this is a kind of a Nike slogan, like if you sweat, you're an athlete. We don't kind of try to make any distinction of like you're a pro or you're sort of up here. We have a kind of inclusive, broad, you know, if you're getting out, if you're being active, that's what we think of as an athlete. So it can be a divisive term, but we try to, you know, make it broad and, you know, make it about just being active. And then the second question was around
New Year's resolution.
New Year's resolutions, yeah. That's an interesting one. We don't have any information necessarily about people setting New Year's resolutions. And so there's a fair amount of kind of analysis that goes into trying to make guesses about people starting New Year's resolutions. So you can see some patterns in data kind of right around the new year. People kind of start off with, you know, consistent activity levels. Maybe they go for a jog every day. Maybe they go for a jog every other day. And so then we really try to like infer based on somebody establishing a pattern and then a pattern breaking off. It's not perfect, but it's pretty interesting to try to kind of circulate around this. It's kind of middle of January, which is earlier than I was thinking it might be. But there's this sort of like, yay, I'm on vacation, like I've got a new resolution, and then sort of like the middle of January doldrums, like I have to go back to work, back to school is a really strong indicator. We tend to see those patterns.
So you talked about some ways that the data is being used to tell stories, and I'm curious as to whether Strava is actually being solicited to tell those stories for other organizations, or if that comes from some mission of Strava's to execute on some other initiative that you guys have, or if that's like a marketing strategy to kind of get, you know, sort of demonstrate how your data can be used. What can you clarify that?
All of the above. We do some proactive, our kind of yearly report. We try to come up with what we think are going to be the most interesting trends and kind of share that externally. We get some inbound of, you know, hey, do you have any data points, particularly from more like kind of cycling, running specific, like Tour de France, like the kind of big events. We'll get some inbound requests for data. We do throughout the year kind of try to pay attention, like the fire story came about from an internal, like, hey, like let's see if we can see something in our data. Coincidentally, a reporter also reached out and said, do you have any kind of thing to say about this? And then on the more research side, working with external, we work with a number of different universities. That tends to be a bit more inbound, but also kind of comes from developing relationships where they know that we have this sort of data set. And so we do kind of try to vet those and you know, work with universities that are kind of doing real rigorous research that is also aligned with our mission.
Hi, my name is Sylvia. Thank you for sharing. And I'm a long distance runner, so I use Strava almost every day. I check my Strava app maybe more than I check Facebook, just to give kudos to my runner friends. My question is around heart rate. Like, how does the data sync up with like what device they use and stuff? Because, you know, that's probably one of the things that I'm interested the most right now.
Yeah, so heart rate's pretty interesting. There are certain kinds of devices that you can record your heart rate with. So a number of smartwatches, Garmin's, Apple Watches have heart rate sensors. We also allow people to record with their phone, and so like a phone in your pocket does not have a heart rate, for example. We allow people to choose whether they want to connect their heart rate data into Strava, so there's a consent. Heart rate data is a kind of special protected class of data under GDPR. And so it's really about whether the device records it and uploads it. There's certain activity types like swimming, for example, usually doesn't record a heart rate because of the water. But if you're recording with a heart rate enabled device and you're running and you upload it, if your heart rate's not coming in, it may have something to do with the consents and whether you've consented or not. We could talk more offline.
Hi, so thank you for the presentation. More on the business side, how does Strava, it's going to be more a financial question, how do you make your profit or benefits? Do you, like, is the app free, or do you use the data? Like, how does it work?
Yeah, so kind of business model. We have a free version of the product that people can use to record and share activities with people. We have a subscription product that we call Summit that has advanced kind of features and functionality that people can subscribe to. We have a partnerships business line where we work with kind of brand gear device partners to do things like sponsored challenges where you might sort of do a certain amount of activity over a month and then get a prize from that sponsor. And then we have a third revenue line that we call Metro, which is works on taking kind of aggregated, de-identified, opted-in data sets of people moving through cities and working with governments, departments of transportation to use that data sets in order to help them decide where to build more bike and pedestrian infrastructure. So we do not sell the data on any sort of individual user basis. The kind of transactions are all around like de-identified and really aggregated sets. Good question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm curious from the experience you have at lots of different companies, kind of how you get buy-in for doing data-driven decision-making if your company that you're at wasn't necessarily originally set up that way, and then kind of how you protect your data team's time to be able to do some of this experimentation and just like looking for possible insights that is a gamble, I guess, because you don't know what you're going to find.
Yeah. Really important part of the process, and I will say it's a process. It's not necessarily a, you're here and then all of a sudden an aha moment happens and you're here. It's really about getting your data into a solid place, winning over kind of people and departments one by one. I always like to start with the folks who are most excited or most inclined and get some wins there, and then try to leverage that into more wins. Don't neglect the power of word of mouth. Somebody who shows up to a meeting with a data-backed reason for building something or strong data about what they did often gets senior level attention. Oh, really? Okay, well, you got that really well thought out, and can cause other people to start scrambling. Hard to start with the person or the team that's most resistant. Like I like to kind of leave them there for a while. I also like to just go and talk with folks and try to sort of make it less scary. Like it can be intimidating. He's like, hi, I'm with the data. Like I'm here to solve all your problems. Like kind of scary. Just sit down. Like what do you do? How do you do it? How do you make decisions? What do you wish you could do? What do you spend a lot of time doing that you wish you didn't have to? Like those often pull out the like, well, I spent a lot of time with this spreadsheet doing all this, mucking around in Excel that I wish I didn't have to do. Oh, I can automate something for you. And try to find those like small wins and really have empathy for people, and try to understand, like is data intimidating for them or is it useful? In terms of carving out the space, so experimentation we've really bundled together with how product teams work, and really done a lot to kind of push that agenda of like, you must do product development in this way doesn't go entirely smoothly at first, but finding those example cases that are wins, trying to stamp that onto other teams. Some of the more data exploration, it's a bit push and pull. It's hard to find that time. Sometimes you get people who are curious and then just sort of like go off on a night or a weekend, or maybe a lull in the year if you have sort of a downtime. We've had pretty good success partnering with our PR team and our kind of marketing team, who then help kind of demand that and make that kind of part of the expected workload. But it does take some time to get into that space, and honestly also building trust with your stakeholders to the point where you can say, well, I'm going to go off and do this thing. I think there's something here, but I'm not entirely sure. If they have a high level of trust, there's more kind of leeway to do that. When you're in that real kind of early trust building stage, it's kind of harder.
We have time for one more.
One more question?
Yeah.
Could go one over here.
Hi, thank you for sharing. So, like you showed, Strava has users all over the world, and potentially the activities that they upload can be in sensitive locations. There was something a couple of years ago where it was in a military base or something, and there was like a news article about that. Has an experience like that changed the way that you handle data and what you share with like reporters and other people?
Yeah, so I think that it hasn't necessarily changed the way that we do any of the processing of the data or the display of the data, but we did go and kind of look at and think about how our privacy settings are set up and how kind of clear and transparent and fine-grained they are. So that specifically was around some activities that were uploaded. We have a kind of public option, which is kind of used by a lot of people so they can sort of be seen anywhere. Maybe that wasn't the right setting for kind of being in a sensitive place. We do kind of allow people a lot of control, but we also have some other settings where you can show activities only to people who are kind of in your following network, so only people you follow and you've allowed to follow you, or you can keep activities completely private. And so we've really tried to go through and make that more explicit, kind of remind people that they're there, work with affected people to make sure they are aware, work with governments to make sure they are communicating properly with the people kind of within their workforce about those kinds of things. So we do try to really think about that, like give people as much control as possible, make it fine-grained, but also transparent. And this stuff isn't super simple, but we do think about it a lot and then really kind of changed our kind of mindset in that direction. All right, thank you.